The morning mist clung to the ancient stones of Windsor Castle as Catherine, Princess of Wales, stood at the tall window of their private quarters. Her fingers traced the condensation on the glass, while she watched the early groundskeepers tend to the perfectly manicured gardens below. The weight of the decision they had made the previous evening still pressed heavily on her shoulders, but there was also something else, a sense of relief that had been building for months. William emerged from their bedroom, already dressed in his navy suit, his face carrying the same mixture of determination and concern that had become familiar to Catherine over the past year. The events that had led them to this moment had been brewing beneath the surface of their public duties for far longer than anyone could have imagined. What the world was about to witness was not a spontaneous decision, but the culmination of countless private conversations, sleepless nights, and careful consideration of their roles as future monarchs. The catalyst had begun 6 months earlier during what should have been a routine visit to a children's hospital in Manchester. Catherine had been speaking with Sarah, a 7-year-old girl battling leukemia, when the child had asked her a question that would echo in her mind for weeks to come. "Princess Kate," the little girl had said with the innocent directness that only children possess, "why do grown-ups say one thing, but do something different?" The question had been prompted by Sarah's confusion about why politicians and leaders often made promises during hospital visits that never seemed to materialize into real change. Catherine had given the diplomatic answer she had been trained to provide, but Sarah's words had planted a seed that would grow into something much larger. That evening, Catherine had shared the conversation with William, and they had talked late into the night about the gap between their public roles and their private convictions. William had his own moment of clarity 3 weeks later during a climate summit in Edinburgh. He had delivered a carefully crafted speech about environmental responsibility, standing before world leaders who nodded approvingly, while knowing that many of them would return home to policies that directly contradicted everything he had just said. The applause felt hollow, and William found himself questioning whether his words carried any real weight or if they were simply part of an elaborate performance that maintained the status quo, while real problems festered beneath the surface. The couple had always been mindful of their unique position in British society, but the events of recent months had forced them to confront an uncomfortable truth. Their influence was vast, but their ability to create meaningful change felt increasingly constrained by tradition, protocol, and the careful balance of constitutional monarchy. They were expected to be symbols of stability and continuity, yet the world around them was crying out for bold leadership and genuine transformation. Their private discussions became more frequent and more intense. They would walk the grounds of their Kensington Palace residence in the early morning hours, speaking in hushed tones about their responsibilities not just to the crown, but to their children and the generations that would inherit the world they were helping to shape. Catherine often spoke about the mothers she met during her charitable work, women who struggled to provide for their families while watching politicians debate policies that seemed disconnected from their daily realities. William shared his frustrations about environmental initiatives that moved at a glacial pace, while climate change accelerated at an alarming rate. The turning point came during a family dinner at Sandringham, where 3 generations of royals gathered around the table that had hosted similar conversations for decades. King Charles spoke passionately about his lifelong commitment to environmental causes and his frustration with the slow pace of change. Queen Camilla shared stories from her literacy programs, describing children who fell through educational cracks that could be easily mended with proper resources and political will. It was Prince George, then 11 years old, who asked the question that crystallized their thinking. "Daddy," he had said during dessert, "when I'm king, will I be able to fix the problems you and Grandpa Charles talk about, or will I just talk about them too?" The silence that followed was profound. William and Catherine exchanged a look across the table that communicated volumes. They realized that their son was already grappling with the same questions that had been keeping them awake at night. The traditional approach, the careful balance of influence without overreach, suddenly felt insufficient for the challenges facing their nation and the world. Over the following weeks, they began to research precedents for what they were considering. They studied the history of royal involvement in social and political issues, examining moments when previous monarchs had chosen to take stands that went beyond traditional ceremonial roles. They consulted with constitutional experts, spoke quietly with trusted advisors, and reached out to leaders in various fields who had managed to create real change through unconventional means. The more they learned, the more convinced they became that their position gave them not just the opportunity, but the responsibility to do more than simply ribbon-cutting and speech-making. They began to envision a different kind of royal leadership, one that was still respectful of constitutional boundaries, but was willing to use their platform to address urgent issues with greater directness and authenticity. Their first test came during a visit to a food bank in Birmingham, where they met families who were struggling to put meals on the table despite working multiple jobs. Instead of the usual protocol of brief conversations and photo opportunities, William and Catherine spent the entire afternoon learning about the systemic issues that kept working families in poverty. They asked detailed questions about government policies, housing costs, and wage structures. They took notes and asked for contact information so they could follow up on specific cases. The food bank director, Margaret Thompson, later told reporters that she had never experienced such genuine engagement from public figures. They weren't just there for the cameras, she said. They wanted to understand the real problems and what it would take to solve them. Princess Catherine asked for specific policy documents, and Prince William wanted to know which government officials had the authority to make changes. That visit marked the beginning of what palace insiders would later describe as a fundamental shift in how William and Catherine approached their royal duties. Instead of accepting briefings that sanitized complex issues, they began demanding raw data and unfiltered perspectives. They started scheduling private meetings with activists, policy experts, and community leaders who could provide insights that went beyond official talking points. The change did not go unnoticed within royal circles. Some advisors expressed concern about the couple's increasingly direct approach to controversial topics. There were whispered conversations about the importance of maintaining political neutrality and avoiding anything that could be perceived as overstepping constitutional bounds. The tension came to a head during a meeting with the private secretary's office, where senior advisors suggested that William and Catherine's recent activities were attracting unwanted scrutiny from government officials. It was during this meeting that William made the statement that would define their new approach. Our duty is not to avoid controversy, but to serve the British people honestly and effectively. If that makes some people uncomfortable, perhaps the problem isn't with our approach, but with their expectations. Catherine supported her husband's position with her own carefully chosen words. We cannot ask our children to inherit a world we were unwilling to fight for, simply because fighting requires us to step outside our comfort zones. The decision to make their statement, the one that would capture the nation's attention and change the trajectory of modern monarchy, crystallized during a late-night conversation in their private study. They had been reviewing reports from their recent engagements, noting the gap between the public response to their appearances and the actual progress on the issues they had highlighted. The pattern was clear. People were inspired by their involvement, but inspiration without action was proving insufficient to create the changes that were desperately needed. William stood at the fireplace, studying the flames as he organized his thoughts. "We have a choice," he said finally. "We can continue doing what's expected of us, attending events and making speeches that make people feel good but don't change anything substantial. Or we can use our position to actually lead, even if it means challenging some long-held assumptions about how royalty should behave." Catherine set down the report she had been reading and looked directly at her husband. "The second option carries risks," she said. "There will be criticism. There will be people who say we're overstepping our bounds or becoming too political." "There are already people saying that," William replied. "The difference is that now we would be earning the criticism by actually accomplishing something meaningful." They spent the next hour outlining what their statement would entail. Not just words, but actions that would demonstrate their commitment to addressing issues that mattered to ordinary British families. They would maintain respect for constitutional boundaries while pushing those boundaries to their constructive limits. They would continue to serve the crown while also serving the people in ways that felt authentic and effective. The clock on the mantelpiece chimed midnight as they finalized their decision. Catherine reached for William's hand, and they stood together in the quiet study, surrounded by books that chronicled centuries of royal history. They were about to add their own chapter to that history, one that would be written not in the language of tradition and protocol, but in the clearer vocabulary of purpose and action. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the curtains of their Windsor Castle residence, William and Catherine prepared for a day that would mark the beginning of a new era in royal leadership. The nation would indeed hold its breath as they stepped forward to make their quiet but powerful statement, not through grand pronouncements or dramatic gestures, but through the accumulated weight of authentic engagement and genuine commitment to the people they served. The morning routine that followed was deceptively normal. Catherine helped their children prepare for school, while William reviewed his schedule with his private secretary. To outside observers, it would appear to be just another day in the life of the royal family. But beneath the surface of routine activities, both William and Catherine carried the knowledge that they were about to embark on a journey that would test not only their resolve, but also the institution they represented. The first phase of their plan would begin that afternoon with what appeared to be a standard visit to a community center in South London. But this visit would be different from any they had conducted before. Instead of the usual carefully orchestrated tour and brief interactions, they would spend the entire day immersed in the community, learning about challenges and working alongside local leaders to develop practical solutions. The community center visit had been planned for weeks, but the approach William and Catherine would take had been redesigned completely in light of their new commitment to meaningful engagement. They would arrive without the usual entourage of media handlers and protocol officers. Instead, they would bring policy advisors and experts who could help them understand the complex issues facing the community and identify specific actions they could take to address those issues. As their car pulled away from Windsor Castle that morning, both William and Catherine felt the mixture of nervousness and excitement that comes with stepping into uncharted territory. They were still the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge, still bound by the responsibilities and expectations that came with their titles. But they were also about to become something new, royal leaders who were willing to risk criticism in order to create real change. The nation might not realize it yet, but the quiet, powerful statement William and Catherine were about to make would resonate far beyond the community center they were visiting that day. It would signal a fundamental shift in how the modern monarchy could function, not as a symbol disconnected from contemporary challenges, but as an institution capable of providing authentic leadership in an era that desperately needed it. As their motorcade made its way through the London traffic, Catherine gazed out at the city she would someday help to rule. The streets were filled with people going about their daily lives. Working parents rushing to jobs that might not pay enough to cover rising costs, students heading to schools that might not have adequate resources, elderly citizens who might be struggling with healthcare systems that seemed increasingly strained. These were the people William and Catherine had committed to serving, not through symbolic gestures or carefully staged appearances, but through sustained effort to understand their challenges and work toward practical solutions. As they prepared to step out of their vehicle and into the community center, William and Catherine carried with them not only the hopes and expectations that always accompanied royal visits, but also their own determination to prove that those hopes and expectations could be met with substance rather than just ceremony. The nation was indeed about to hold its breath, though most people didn't know it yet. What they would witness over the coming days would challenge assumptions about royal leadership and demonstrate that quiet, powerful statements could be more effective than grand proclamations in creating the kind of change that actually improved people's lives. The Southern community center buzzed with an energy that felt different from typical royal visits. Instead of the usual red carpets and formal receiving lines, William and Catherine walked through the main entrance like any other visitors, greeting staff and volunteers with genuine warmth. The center director, Catherine, headed straight to the childcare section, where single mothers attended job training classes while their children received educational support. But rather than the customary tour and polite conversation, she sat down with Maria Santos, a 28-year-old mother of two who was studying to become a certified nursing assistant while struggling to manage rent payments on her small flat. "Tell me about the real obstacles you're facing," Catherine said, pulling out a notebook that palace staff had never seen her use during public engagements. Not the polite version for visitors, but the actual problems that keep you awake at night. Maria hesitated at first, uncertain whether such directness was appropriate when speaking to the Princess of Wales. But Catherine's genuine interest and persistent questioning gradually opened a floodgate of detailed information about the systemic barriers facing working-class families in London. Maria explained how the timing of job training programs conflicted with school schedules, forcing her to choose between advancing her career and being present for her children. She described the impossible mathematics of housing costs that consumed 70% of her income, leaving little room for the small emergencies that could derail months of careful budgeting. While Catherine gathered this information, William was in the center's employment services office, speaking with David Kumar, a counselor who helped recently unemployed workers navigate the complex web of benefits and job placement services. William's questions went far beyond the typical royal inquiry about how things were going. He wanted to understand the specific policy gaps that prevented effective support for unemployed workers, the bureaucratic obstacles that delayed assistance, and the coordination failures between different government agencies. "The problem isn't that people don't want to work," David explained as William took careful notes. "The problem is that the system is designed like a maze where the exit keeps moving. We have job training programs that prepare people for industries that are eliminating positions. We have housing assistance that requires employment and employment programs that require stable housing. Everything is connected, but nothing is coordinated." William's background in military logistics helped him quickly grasp the systemic nature of the problems David described. In the military, he had learned that complex challenges required integrated solutions rather than isolated interventions. The approach he was seeing in social services reminded him of military operations where different units worked at cross purposes because they lacked unified command and shared objectives. After spending 2 hours gathering detailed information from staff and clients, William and Catherine reconvened in the center's main conference room. But instead of delivering the standard remarks that would typically conclude a royal visit, they asked for an extended meeting with community leaders, local government representatives, and service providers who could help them understand the broader context of what they had observed. The meeting that followed lasted 4 hours and covered topics that royal visits rarely addressed directly. Housing policy, employment training, childcare availability, transportation access, mental health services, and educational resources were examined, not as separate issues, but as interconnected elements of a system that was failing to serve the people it was designed to help. Margaret Foster, a local counselor who had worked in Southwark for 15 years, later described the meeting as unlike any interaction she had ever had with senior government officials or public figures. "They asked the kind of questions that you ask when you actually intend to do something about the answers," she said. "They wanted names of specific officials who had the authority to make changes. They wanted copies of policy documents and budget allocations. They wanted to know who was blocking progress and why." The most significant moment came when Catherine posed a question that cut to the heart of the systemic problems they had been discussing. "If you had the authority to make 3 changes that would have the greatest impact on the families using this center, what would those changes be, and what prevents them from happening now?" The answers revealed a pattern that would become central to William and Catherine's subsequent actions. The most effective interventions were often blocked not by lack of resources or political opposition, but by bureaucratic inertia, poor coordination between agencies, and the absence of sustained attention from decision-makers who had the power to cut through administrative obstacles. James Mitchell, the center director, provided a specific example that illustrated the broader problem. "We have families who qualify for multiple assistance programs, but each program requires separate applications, different documentation, and different reporting requirements. A single mother might spend 20 hours per week just managing paperwork for services that could be coordinated through a single integrated system. We've been proposing streamlined approaches for 3 years, but they get lost in committee reviews and bureaucratic consultations. William leaned forward in his chair, his expression indicating the kind of focused attention he typically reserved for military briefings. Who specifically has the authority to implement the integration you're describing? The question prompted a detailed discussion of government structure that revealed how responsibility for different aspects of social services was distributed across multiple departments, agencies, and levels of government. The fragmentation wasn't accidental or necessarily malicious, but it was incredibly effective at preventing the kind of coordinated action that could address complex social problems. Catherine asked a follow-up question that demonstrated how seriously she and William were taking this information. Would it be helpful if we attended the next meeting where these coordination issues are discussed? Not as ceremonial participants, but as active advocates for the changes you're describing. The suggestion created a moment of surprised silence in the room. Margaret Foster later recalled thinking that she must have misunderstood the question, because it seemed to imply that the future king and queen were offering to involve themselves directly in the bureaucratic processes that typically operated far beneath the notice of senior royals. But William clarified their intention with characteristic directness. We're not talking about symbolic support or photo opportunities. We're talking about using our position to ensure that these meetings happen, that the right people attend them, and that decisions get made instead of deferred. The community center visit concluded with William and Catherine committing to specific follow-up actions that went far beyond the usual thank you notes and charitable donations that typically followed royal engagements. They scheduled a series of private meetings with government officials who had direct responsibility for the policy areas they had discussed. They requested detailed briefings on budget allocations and administrative procedures. They asked to be included in communications about proposed changes to social services coordination. Most significantly, they announced their intention to return to the community center in 6 weeks to review progress on the specific issues that had been identified during their visit. This wasn't a vague promise to stay engaged, but a concrete commitment to measure results and maintain pressure for improvement. The drive back to Kensington Palace was quieter than usual, with both William and Catherine processing what they had learned and considering the implications of the commitments they had made. The information they had gathered would require them to become more directly involved in government operations than any senior royals in recent memory. They would need to master policy details, build relationships with mid-level bureaucrats, and navigate political sensitivities that their traditional ceremonial role had previously allowed them to avoid. Catherine broke the silence as their car passed through Hyde Park. We've committed ourselves to something that's going to require us to operate differently than we ever have before. William nodded, still reviewing the notes he had taken during their extended meeting. The alternative is to continue making speeches about issues we understand superficially while nothing substantial changes. At least now, we'll know whether our position can actually be used to improve people's lives or whether it's just an elaborate performance. The couple spent the evening in William's study, surrounded by the policy documents, contact information, and action items they had collected during their community center visit. They divided the follow-up tasks between them based on their respective interests and expertise, but they also acknowledged that they were entering territory where their royal training had not prepared them for the level of detailed involvement they were planning. Catherine focused on the child care and family support issues, recognizing that her background in early childhood development could provide valuable perspective on policy discussions. William concentrated on employment and housing coordination, drawing on his military experience with logistics and systems integration. Both of them committed to learning about government budgeting processes that would determine whether good intentions could be translated into adequate resources. Their first test would come the following week, when they were scheduled to meet with Treasury officials who controlled funding for the programs they had discussed at the community center. The meeting had been arranged as a standard briefing about social services spending, but William and Catherine intended to transform it into a working session focused on specific improvements rather than general information sharing. The Treasury meeting would be particularly significant because it would demonstrate whether their new approach could produce concrete results or whether it would be absorbed into the standard bureaucratic processes that had previously frustrated community advocates and service providers. William and Catherine understood that their credibility with the communities they were trying to serve would depend on their ability to deliver actual changes rather than just increased attention to important issues. As they prepared for the Treasury meeting, both William and Catherine studied the kind of detailed budget documents and policy analyses that had never been part of their royal education. They consulted with experts who could help them ask the right questions and recognize bureaucratic evasions. They developed specific proposals that could be implemented within existing legal frameworks, avoiding the kind of constitutional complications that might provide excuses for inaction. The evening before the Treasury meeting, Catherine reviewed her notes one final time while William practiced the precise questions he intended to ask about budget allocations and administrative procedures. They had moved far beyond the ceremonial aspects of royal duty into territory that felt more like actual governance, even though they maintained careful respect for constitutional boundaries. Their bedroom conversation that night reflected the weight of what they were attempting. Catherine acknowledged her nervousness about the next day's meeting, recognizing that they would be evaluated not just as symbols of the monarchy, but as serious participants in policy discussions. William expressed confidence in their preparation, but also awareness that they were testing assumptions about royal effectiveness that had never been rigorously examined. The alarm that woke them the next morning marked the beginning of what would prove to be a pivotal day in their evolution as royal leaders. The Treasury meeting would determine whether their community center commitments were achievable goals or naive promises that would ultimately disappoint the people they were trying to serve. As they dressed for the meeting, both William and Catherine carried the quiet determination that had marked their approach since deciding to move beyond traditional royal engagement towards something more substantive and potentially more effective. The nation was continuing to hold its breath, though most people remained unaware of the transformation that was occurring beneath the surface of apparently routine royal activities. The Treasury building on Whitehall had hosted countless meetings between government officials and interested parties, but it had rarely been the site of the kind of detailed policy discussion that William and Catherine were about to initiate. Their presence would command attention, but their effectiveness would depend on their mastery of complex information and their ability to maintain focus on specific outcomes rather than general expressions of concern. The oak-paneled conference room in the Treasury building had witnessed decades of high-level government meetings, but the atmosphere on this particular Tuesday morning felt distinctly different. Senior Treasury officials arranged their briefing materials with unusual care, aware that they were about to engage with royal participants who had demonstrated an unexpected depth of preparation and directness of purpose. Chancellor Patricia Whitman had initially approached the meeting as a routine courtesy briefing, the kind of informational session that allowed government departments to demonstrate their responsiveness to royal interest while maintaining control over the scope and direction of discussion. But the advanced materials provided by William and Catherine's office indicated that this would be a working session focused on specific budget allocations and administrative procedures rather than general policy overviews. William and Catherine arrived precisely on time, accompanied only by their private secretaries and a policy advisor whose presence signaled their serious intent to engage with technical details. The usual protocol of formal introductions and ceremonial pleasantries was abbreviated as they moved quickly into the substance of their agenda. "We've reviewed your department's spending on family support services in South London," Catherine began, consulting the detailed notes she had prepared based on her community center visit. "The allocation appears generous on paper, but we're seeing significant gaps in service delivery that suggest coordination problems rather than funding shortages." Her directness clearly caught Chancellor Whitman off guard. The Treasury chief had expected to deliver a prepared presentation about government commitments to social services, not to respond to specific observations about administrative failures. But Catherine's question was backed by detailed evidence that made evasive responses difficult to sustain. William followed up with his own pointed inquiry about employment services coordination. The current system requires unemployed workers to navigate separate processes for job training, housing assistance, and childcare support. Each process has different eligibility requirements, documentation standards, and reporting deadlines. Our research suggests that streamlining these processes could improve outcomes while reducing administrative costs. What prevents this integration from happening? The question demonstrated Williams' understanding that bureaucratic efficiency aligned with fiscal responsibility, making his proposal difficult to dismiss on either policy or budgetary grounds. He had prepared by studying successful integration models from other countries and calculating potential cost savings from reduced administrative redundancy. The Treasury officials found themselves in the unfamiliar position of defending specific administrative procedures to royal questioners who had done their homework more thoroughly than many parliamentary committee members. Chancellor Whitman attempted to redirect the conversation toward broader policy goals, but Catherine and William consistently brought the discussion back to concrete implementation challenges that required specific responses. "We understand the complexity of government coordination," Catherine acknowledged during a particularly detailed exchange about interagency communication protocols. "But we've spoken with families who spend more time managing bureaucratic requirements than they do on job training or child development. That suggests a system that serves administrative convenience rather than human needs." The most significant breakthrough came when William presented a specific proposal that had emerged from his community center discussions. Working with service providers and policy experts, he had developed a pilot program that would integrate multiple social services through a single intake process and coordinated case management approach. The proposal included detailed cost projections, implementation timelines, and outcome measurements that addressed every concern typically raised about administrative innovations. "We're not asking you to redesign the entire social services system," William explained as he distributed copies of the proposal. "We're suggesting a limited pilot program in 3 London boroughs that would test integration concepts while maintaining existing service levels. If the pilot succeeds, expansion could be gradual and evidence-based. If it fails, the investment is limited and the learning is valuable." Chancellor Whitman studied the proposal documents while her staff whispered urgently among themselves. The level of detail and practical sophistication was far beyond what they had expected from a royal initiative. The proposal addressed funding mechanisms, legal authorities, coordination protocols, and evaluation methods and language that demonstrated genuine understanding of government operations. The discussion that followed lasted 3 hours and covered topics ranging from budget allocation procedures to interdepartmental coordination agreements. William and Catherine demonstrated not just familiarity with policy details, but also strategic thinking about implementation challenges that had historically derailed well-intentioned government initiatives. Deputy Chancellor Michael Roberts later described the meeting as unlike any interaction he had experienced with non-government stakeholders. "They weren't there to lobby for increased spending or to complain about existing policies," he said. "They were there to solve specific problems using existing resources more effectively. They understood how government works well enough to propose changes that were actually achievable." The meeting concluded with Chancellor Whitman committing to a detailed review of the integration pilot proposal, with a response timeline of 4 weeks rather than the months typically required for new policy initiatives. More significantly, she agreed to William and Catherine's request for regular progress meetings rather than the standard practice of providing written updates through official channels. As they left the Treasury building, William and Catherine felt cautiously optimistic about the response their proposal had received. But they also understood that government commitments made in meetings were often diluted or delayed during subsequent review processes. Their next challenge would be maintaining momentum while navigating the complex bureaucratic procedures that could transform promising proposals into administrative studies that produced reports instead of results. The drive back to Kensington Palace provided an opportunity to debrief their Treasury experience and plan their approach for the follow-up meetings they had scheduled with other government departments. The integration pilot they had proposed would require cooperation from multiple agencies, and each would need to be convinced that participation aligned with their institutional interests. Catherine's afternoon appointment was with officials from the Department for Education, where she would discuss the childcare components of their integration proposal. Her preparation for this meeting built on conversations with early childhood development experts and her own academic background in psychology. She intended to present evidence that coordinated family support services could improve educational outcomes while reducing long-term social services costs. William's parallel meeting was with housing ministry officials, where he would address the residential stability components that were essential for effective employment training. His military background had given him insights into the relationship between housing security and job performance that could inform civilian policy discussions. Both meetings were scheduled for the following day, and the evening was spent in final preparation that included reviewing technical documents, consulting with experts, and rehearsing responses to anticipated objections or deflections. The level of preparation required for effective government engagement was far more intensive than anything their traditional royal duties had demanded. Catherine spent several hours that evening studying educational research that demonstrated the connection between family stability and academic achievement. She identified specific data points that supported her argument for integrated services, focusing on evidence that government officials would find difficult to dispute. Her goal was to present the educational benefits of their proposal in language that aligned with existing departmental priorities. William reviewed housing policy documents that revealed the complex relationship between residential programs and employment services. He discovered that coordination failures often resulted from different departments using incompatible eligibility criteria and conflicting priority systems. His proposal would address these technical problems while demonstrating respect for each department's institutional responsibilities. Their preparation also included strategic discussions about how to maintain pressure for implementation without overstepping constitutional boundaries. They needed to be persistent enough to achieve results while remaining respectful of democratic processes and administrative autonomy. The balance between royal influence and governmental independence required careful navigation that had no clear precedents in recent monarchical history. The next morning brought news that would test their resolve and demonstrate the challenges they faced in sustaining political attention on complex social issues. The morning newspapers featured headlines about a foreign policy crisis that dominated the political agenda and pushed domestic policy discussions to secondary importance. Treasury officials were suddenly focused on international trade negotiations, while departmental meetings were being rescheduled to accommodate crisis management priorities. Catherine and William discussed the impact of shifting political attention during their morning walk through Kensington Gardens. They recognized that their integration proposal would need to compete with more dramatic issues for government attention, and that sustained advocacy would be required to prevent their initiative from being delayed indefinitely while officials addressed more pressing concerns. Their response to this challenge revealed the strategic thinking that would characterize their approach throughout the implementation process. Instead of accepting delays or reduced priority, they used their unique position to maintain momentum by scheduling individual meetings with key officials and providing additional research that demonstrated the connections between their domestic policy proposals and broader government objectives. Catherine's meeting with education officials became an opportunity to discuss how family stability programs could improve educational outcomes that were relevant to international competitiveness concerns. She presented research showing that countries with integrated social services produced better educational results than systems with fragmented support structures. Williams' housing ministry meeting focused on connections between residential stability and workforce development that were relevant to economic growth objectives. He argued that employment training programs achieved better results when participants had secure housing, making integrated services a workforce development strategy rather than just a social welfare initiative. Both meetings demonstrated their ability to frame their proposals in terms of governmental priorities while maintaining focus on the community-level problems they were trying to solve. The approach required sophisticated understanding of bureaucratic incentives and political dynamics that went far beyond traditional royal engagement with government operations. The afternoon brought their first significant victory when the Education Department agreed to participate in their pilot program integration initiative. The commitment came with conditions and limitations, but it represented concrete progress toward the coordinated approach they had advocated since their community center visit. The Housing Ministry meeting concluded with a more qualified response that included requests for additional information and further consultations. But even this cautious reaction represented engagement with their proposal rather than the polite deflection that typically characterized government responses to external policy suggestions. As evening approached, William and Catherine met in the private study where they had first decided to pursue their new approach to royal leadership. The stack of government documents, policy proposals, and meeting notes that covered their desk table represented weeks of intensive work that had produced their first tangible results. Catherine reviewed the Education Department commitment letter, while William organized the follow-up materials requested by Housing Ministry officials. The administrative details required for government coordination were far more complex than either of them had anticipated, but they were beginning to understand how sustained effort could navigate bureaucratic processes that seemed impenetrable from the outside. Their evening conversation reflected both satisfaction with the progress they had achieved and recognition of how much work remained to be done. The pilot program integration would require months of detailed planning, coordination meetings, and implementation oversight. Their role would need to evolve from advocates for change to participants in complex administrative processes. But they had also demonstrated something that had broader implications for royal effectiveness in contemporary governance. Their detailed preparation, strategic thinking, and sustained engagement had produced governmental responses that traditional ceremonial involvement had never achieved. They were proving that modern monarchy could contribute to practical problem-solving rather than just symbolic representation. The next phase of their initiative would test whether royal influence could sustain bureaucratic momentum through the detailed implementation processes that would determine whether their proposal produced actual improvements in people's lives. The nation continued to hold its breath, though the transformation occurring in royal leadership was becoming visible to observers who understood how government coordination actually functioned. William and Catherine had moved beyond symbolic advocacy to become active participants in policy development and implementation oversight. Their success would be measured not by the positive attention their efforts attracted, but by the concrete improvements they achieved for families struggling with the systemic problems they had committed to solving. 6 months after their first community center visit, William and Catherine stood in the same Southwark facility where the transformation had begun, but the atmosphere around them had changed dramatically. The walls now displayed flowcharts showing the integrated services coordination system that had emerged from their pilot program, and the staff moved with the confidence of people who had witnessed bureaucratic obstacles being systematically dismantled rather than just discussed. Maria Santos, the single mother who had first explained the maze of social services to Catherine, now served as a case study coordinator for the integration pilot. Her own life had been transformed through the streamlined support system, but more importantly, she had become an advocate who helped other families navigate services that now functioned as a unified support network rather than competing bureaucracies. The difference is that someone actually listened and then did something about what they heard. Maria explained to the small group of government officials who had accompanied William and Catherine on this follow-up visit. Before, I spent more time filling out forms than I did studying or caring for my children. Now, everything works together. The pilot program had exceeded even William and Catherine's optimistic projections. Administrative costs had decreased by 30%, while service effectiveness had improved by measurable margins across multiple categories. Families enrolled in the integrated system showed higher employment rates, better educational outcomes for children, and increased residential stability compared to control groups receiving traditional fragmented services. But the quantitative success was less significant than the qualitative transformation that had occurred in how government departments approached complex social problems. The coordination protocols developed for the pilot program were being studied by other regions across the United Kingdom, and international delegations had begun requesting briefings on the integration model that had emerged from royal advocacy. Catherine spent the morning reviewing case files with service coordinators who described the practical benefits of unified intake procedures and shared case management systems. The technical improvements were substantial, but the human impact was more compelling. Families who had previously fallen through bureaucratic gaps were now receiving comprehensive support that addressed multiple challenges simultaneously. William met with department heads who had initially been skeptical about royal involvement in administrative details, but had become strong advocates for continued collaboration. The housing ministry official who had requested additional information during their first meeting now described their integration model as the most effective innovation he had seen in 20 years of government service. "Your Royal Highnesses understood something that we had forgotten," explained Sarah Chun, the regional coordination director who had overseen pilot implementation. "Government services are supposed to help people solve problems, not create additional problems through bureaucratic complexity. The integration model gets back to that basic purpose." The success of their pilot program had attracted attention that went far beyond social services coordination. Political observers had begun analyzing their approach as a potential model for royal engagement that maintained constitutional appropriateness while achieving practical results. Academic researchers were studying their methods as examples of how institutional influence could be used to improve government effectiveness. More significantly, William and Catherine had received informal approaches from government departments in other policy areas who were interested in applying their collaborative model to different challenges. Environmental coordination, healthcare administration, and educational policy officials had all requested briefings on their integration methodology. But the couple had also learned important lessons about the limitations and responsibilities that came with their expanded role in government operations. The success of their pilot program had created expectations for continued involvement that required them to carefully balance royal duties with administrative oversight responsibilities. Their afternoon session at the community center included a candid discussion with Treasury officials about scaling their integration model to other regions. Chancellor Whitman, who had initially approached their proposals with bureaucratic caution, now served as one of their strongest governmental advocates. "The fiscal benefits alone justify expansion," Chancellor Whitman explained to the assembled group. "But the more important result is that we've demonstrated how government can work more effectively without requiring additional resources or major legislative changes. The integration model uses existing authorities and funding streams more efficiently." The expansion discussion revealed both the potential and the challenges of their success. Replicating the pilot program would require sustained attention from William and Catherine, along with continued collaboration with multiple government departments. They would need to maintain their detailed understanding of administrative procedures while managing their traditional royal responsibilities. Catherine addressed this challenge directly during her remarks to the assembled officials and community representatives. "Our involvement in this project has taught us that effective government requires sustained attention to implementation details, not just ceremonial support for good intentions. We are committed to continued engagement, but we also want to ensure that the improvements we've achieved can function independently of royal oversight." Her statement reflected the strategic thinking that had characterized their approach throughout the integration process. They understood that lasting change required institutional capacity rather than just high-level advocacy. Their goal had always been to demonstrate that better coordination was possible, then to help government departments develop the systems and procedures needed to sustain improvements without ongoing royal intervention. William's contribution to the scaling discussion focused on the replication methodology they had developed with government partners. The integration model could be adapted to different regions and policy areas, but successful implementation required careful attention to local conditions and existing administrative structures. What we've learned is that bureaucratic problems often have technical solutions, William observed. But implementing those solutions requires the kind of sustained collaboration between different levels of government that doesn't happen automatically. Our role has been to facilitate that collaboration and maintain focus on practical results. The community center visit concluded with William and Catherine announcing their next initiative, which would apply their integration methodology to environmental policy coordination. Working with departments responsible for energy, transportation, housing, and local government, they would attempt to streamline the bureaucratic processes that had historically prevented effective climate action. The environmental initiative represented both an expansion of their approach and a test of whether their methodology could address policy challenges that were even more complex and politically sensitive in social services coordination. Climate policy involved multiple levels of government, diverse stakeholder groups, and technical issues that required specialized expertise. But their social services success had given them credibility with government officials who understood that their involvement produced practical improvements rather than just increased attention. Department heads who had initially viewed royal engagement as ceremonial obligation now saw collaboration with William and Catherine as an opportunity to achieve results that had previously seemed impossible. 6 months earlier, they had been frustrated by the gap between their ceremonial roles and their desire to address serious problems. Now, they were actively involved in policy implementation while maintaining appropriate respect for constitutional boundaries. We've proven that our position can be used to improve government effectiveness, Catherine observed as they reviewed the day's accomplishments. The question now is how to sustain that improvement while managing our other responsibilities. William's response demonstrated the strategic thinking that had characterized their approach since their first community center visit. The goal was never to become government administrators, but to use our influence to help government work better. The integration model can function without us now, which means we've achieved what we set out to accomplish. Their success had indeed demonstrated that modern monarchy could contribute to practical governance while respecting democratic institutions and constitutional limitations. They had used their unique position to facilitate cooperation between government departments, maintain focus on implementation details, and sustain political attention on complex problems that typically received only superficial consideration. The environmental initiative would provide another test of their methodology, but they approached it with confidence gained from their social services experience. They understood how to prepare for technical discussions, how to build consensus among competing institutional interests, and how to maintain momentum through the administrative processes that determined whether good intentions translated into effective action. The next morning brought news coverage of their community center visit that focused on the tangible results they had achieved rather than the ceremonial aspects of royal engagement. Political commentators were beginning to recognize that William and Catherine had developed an approach to public service that combined traditional monarchical influence with contemporary problem-solving effectiveness. The coverage also included interviews with families who had benefited from the integrated services coordination, providing human faces for the bureaucratic improvements that might otherwise have seemed abstractly technical. Maria Santos spoke eloquently about the difference between government services that worked against each other and services that work together to support family stability. But the most significant recognition came from government officials who acknowledged that royal involvement had achieved coordination breakthroughs that had eluded previous reform efforts. The integration model was being studied not just as a successful pilot program, but as a demonstration of how institutional leadership could improve democratic governance. International attention had also begun to focus on their approach, with delegations from other constitutional monarchies requesting briefings on methods for constructive royal engagement in contemporary policy challenges. The model they had developed was being examined as a potential template for modernizing monarchical institutions without compromising democratic principles. As they prepared for their first environmental coordination meeting the following week, William and Catherine reflected on how far they had traveled from their initial frustrations with ceremonial imitations. They had demonstrated that quiet, sustained engagement could produce more substantial results than dramatic gestures or symbolic advocacy. Their transformation had occurred gradually and deliberately, building credibility through practical accomplishments rather than public declarations. The nation had indeed held its breath as they made their quiet, powerful statement, but the statement had been made through actions rather than words, through sustained effort rather than momentary attention. The morning newspapers featured editorial commentary recognizing that William and Catherine had redefined royal effectiveness for the contemporary era. They had proven that monarchical influence could enhance democratic governance rather than competing with it, that traditional institutions could adapt to modern challenges while maintaining their essential character. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from the families whose lives had been improved through better government coordination. Their letters and messages provided evidence that royal leadership could produce tangible benefits for ordinary people facing complex challenges that required sustained institutional attention. As William and Catherine began their preparation for environmental policy coordination, they carried with them the knowledge that they had successfully transformed both their own roles and broader expectations for how monarchy could function in the 21st century. The quiet, powerful statement they had made would continue to resonate through the improved government services that would outlast their direct involvement. The nation could finally exhale, knowing that their future monarchs had demonstrated the wisdom, dedication, and practical effectiveness needed to serve contemporary challenges while honoring historical responsibilities. The transformation was complete, but the work of applying their proven methodology to new challenges was just beginning. Their success with social services integration had established a foundation for continued innovation in royal leadership, proving that tradition and effectiveness could enhance each other when combined with strategic thinking and sustained commitment to practical results. The quiet revolution they had initiated would continue to unfold through their expanding engagement with the complex governance challenges facing modern Britain.